amendment. We'd like to thank you for coming to our event, and we'd like to especially thank the Geneva Environmental Network for hosting and for streaming this event. And this event will be recorded and available on the Basel Action Network and the Geneva Environmental Network's website. So first, after I give you this welcome, we'll go to the legal background of Article 11 and the plastic amendment, and that will be delivered by David. And then we'll look into 3 cases, and that will be, Jim will talk about that. And then we'll have people from the ground, one from Mexico and one from Eastern Europe. And then David will look at the danger of using Article 11, again from a legal perspective, to ignore the Basel obligations. And then Jim will finish with NGO recommendations before we go into a questions round. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. I'm Salome Sterli. I work at the Basel Action Network. And then we'll have David Azoulay from the Center for International Environmental Law. And then Jim Packett from the Basel Action Network. And then online, through they're calling in, we have Marisa Hakot from Fronteras Comunes and Jindrik Petrelik from Arnica. We wrote a report on the subject we're talking tonight and also a delegate alert. And you can find our report through this link or on our website. And if you'd like to have it and you're not quick enough, we'll play in this link again at the end. But I'll give you a couple of seconds. So with this, I'll hand over to David, and he'll talk about a legal background.
Thank you very much, Salome. Thank you very much to all of you for having joined us for this event. So this is the part of the side event that's going to be a little wonky, but I hope you'll stick with us and we'll try to introduce also and set the stage for why this is actually a very important issue and a critical issue for us to discuss for how the convention is being implemented today, how it's being used, and what it means for the future of the convention. So, first of all, going back to the origin of Article 11, because we've been talking about Article 11, it's useful to say a little summary or background of where these discussions come from. When the Basel Convention was adopted a few years ago, it was made very clear by the negotiating party that there should be no reservations allowed to the convention. So parties accept the whole convention that cannot pick and choose from the various provisions of the convention. And as part of the convention, the idea was to restrict the trade of hazardous and other waste, and to restrict it to trade between parties and subject and control this particular trade to what is currently referred to as the Basel control, the prior informed consent procedures, and a few other elements. That restriction of the trade was used, first of all, because it was an essential part of reaching the objective of the convention, and was also made as a way to encourage ratification by as many countries as possible. And one could say that this was a very successful part of the plan, because today the Basel Convention is a nearly universal convention with only a few countries around the world not ratified and who are currently not party to the Basel Conventions. At the beginning, of course, as with international processes, there were just a few parties, and because that could cause trade disruption, particular provisions was considered to avoid discriminations between parties and non-parties and to avoid trade disruptions. And so the negotiators decided to allow for exceptions to the overall interdiction of trading listed waste under Basel between parties and non-parties. And this is where the Article 11 came in. While a possibility to trade between party and non-parties was included in the in the original text of the convention, it was very tightly restricted and framed to ensure that these exceptions could not be taken advantage of to go around the objectives and working and functioning of the convention. And so the only way parties can trade with non-parties, as mentioned in this in the Article 11 in the Article 11 of the Basel Convention, was that through the conclusion of legal agreements between parties and non-parties that provide an equivalent level of control as the convention itself. Because I'm a lawyer, we're going to get into the text itself a little longer, but this, and also we'll come back to this wording of equivalent level of control that arose at a later stage in the life and discussion of the convention. So, how is this Article 11 structured? It was divided in two parts. The first part, the first part was designed to address the trade between parties and non-parties once the convention will have entered into force. And the second paragraph was focusing specifically on how to allow trade before the entry into force of the convention, and we'll not be talking about that second part of the agreement today. So we'll be looking specifically at the paragraph 1 of Article 11, which is the one relevant for our conversation. So what does the text say? I'm going to engage in a little tedious reading of what the convention text. I'm sorry about this, but I think it's important to go back to the original wording. When parties may enter into bilateral, multilateral, regional agreements or arrangements regarding transboundary movement of hazardous waste and other waste, and it's important that those two parts are listed, with parties or non-parties, provided, and that's the important part, that such agreement or arrangement do not derogate from the environmentally sound management of hazardous waste and other waste as required by this convention. These agreements or arrangements should stipulate provisions which are not less environmentally sound than those provided by this convention, in particular taking into account the interests of developing countries. So as you'll see, it is dense, and there's even a slight repetition where would argue about the need to ensure environmentally sound management of waste as defined by the conventions to allow trade between parties and non-parties. And the fact that it's repeated in two different sentences and structured in two different ways stresses the importance, because as you've all been parts to some of those discussions, we don't usually like to duplicate and repeat languages unless it is for a particular purpose. This was the case here. So how is environmentally sound management of waste defined in the convention? It is about taking all practical steps, which is a very broad language, to ensure that hazardous waste and other wastes are managed in a manner which will protect human health and the environment against the adverse effects which may result from such waste. Again, you'll notice the quite general wording that is being used, and not only broad, but quite deep specification of all practical steps. Any of you who have been dealing with legal text and lawyers in general know that we don't usually like to be as general as all practical steps. We try to be very specific. So when negotiators include text such as all practical steps, it should be taken very literally. So this question of whether a separate agreement can be considered an Article 11 agreement or not was actually the object of quite a large number of debates and discussions within the COPs and within the discussion of the governing body of the Basel Convention. And this came up when a regional convention called the IMO Hong Kong Convention was proposed for entry into force. And this convention was dealing specifically with a categories of waste that was regulated under the Basel Convention, the waste ships. And so that appeared during the debate on ships recycling that happened between COP7 and COP10. And the result of this debate led to the paraphrase that I've used in my introductory slide about the equivalent level of control. In order to not always have to repeat the whole text from the first paragraph of Article 11, it was boiled down of an understanding by all the parties that the Article 11 of the Basel Convention required from the arrangement that would be concluded to be claimed to be valid under the convention and under the Article 11 is that those arrangements and agreements should provide an equivalent level of control to what the original text of the Basel Convention says, again, which is the equivalent level of control is ensuring, amongst other things, that waste controlled and listed under the conventions are subject to environmentally sound management, which itself is described as taking all practical steps to avoid health and environmental impacts. So, what are the core requirements of the Basel Convention in relation to environmentally sound management of hazardous waste? First of all, we're talking about measures giving exporting and importing countries assurances of the environmentally sound management of the waste. It means that both exporting and importing countries need to have the guarantee before the movement happens that the waste will actually be managed in an environmentally sound manner as defined by the convention. It also provides a strict control system that is based on the prior informed notification and consent before the transboundary movement. It applies to the full scope, as I highlighted when I read Article 11 before. It's waste listed, defined as hazardous and other waste. So it's not only for hazardous waste or other wastes, it's for all the waste under the scope of the convention. And another element of ESM is to guarantee that parties would insert in their national legal framework a definition and a qualification of what is defined as illegal waste trade under the convention would be considered a criminal offense and the responsibility to re-import such waste. So that is for the key part and the historical and slightly wonky part of we're almost done with the wonky legal parts. I'm sorry, then it's going to become more interesting. I promise other speakers are going to be better than I am. But because what we're talking today and what we're seeing currently, and the reason that we organized this side event and some of the legal analysis were produced is because as the scope of the convention grew and evolved, some countries and parties started to develop some, I would say, original and innovative interpretation of Article 11 that are proving to be problematic and probably not entirely legally valid, as we'll discuss later, as we'll discuss later today. And those happen in particular when the convention started to regulate specifically plastic waste, and that is the Basel Plastic Amendments that was adopted a few years ago. So at COP14, the convention decided to its control or to bring into the scope of the convention specific categories of plastic waste. That was for the first time, because until then, plastic waste could be traded freely. And so I am not going to go into the details of what the Plastic Amendment actually says, but it's useful to remember that the Basel Plastic Amendments was adopted by consensus, and that meaning that all of the parties agreed to accept them and to implement them properly. There were a few notifications before its entry into force that some countries said that they might have trouble, and so they suspended the implementation of the Basel Plastic Amendment, but all of those were lifted before the actual entry into force in 2020. Which means that they're now binding for all parties to the Basel Plastic Convention. And now we're going to get to the core of these issues, because there exists a certain number of Article 11 agreements that have been passed, in particular, something that is called the OECD Council decision. The OECD Council decision is an agreement that was adopted prior to the entry into force of the Article 11 agreement, that would regulate the trade of waste generally, but in particular the waste covered by the convention between the OECD parties. And as it says on the slide, this is the best known and most used Article 11 agreement. The way the OECD decision works is that by default, because it is designed to implement implement the rules for the trade of waste covered by the Basel Convention between OECD parties, and because the vast majority of the OECD members are also parties to the Basel Convention, all save one, the OECD decision is drafted in a way that all new Basel listing, so for example, those of the various plastic waste that were categorized as hazardous or other waste in the Basel Plastic Amendment, were automatically incorporated to the list of the annexes of the OECD decision, turning them into listed waste, unless one of the OECD parties, member states, decides to object to that automatic listing. In the case where there's an objection, then a process of conciliation between the different parties is developed, organized by the Secretariat of the OECD to try to find a solution to ensure both the integrity of the OECD decision as an Article 11 agreement and guarantee that the member state of the OECD could still comply with their obligations under the Basel Convention. After the adoption of the Basel Plastic Amendment, the US objected to the automatic adoption of the Plastic Amendment, at least for the part of them that was for what is considered other waste, that we often refer to as Y48 plastic waste. And the discussions went on for, I think, a year and a half, and some of them were quite intense within the OECD, but unfortunately, no consensus for a possible alternative text could be reached among the OECD member states. So as a result, and according to the original text of the OECD decisions, OECD member states retain the right to control such waste according to domestic and international laws. And of course, in this particular case, international laws mainly refer to the Basel Convention. So what it effectively means is that for those wastes for which that could not be automatically integrated to the OECD decisions, the parties to the Basel Convention remain bound by the text the Basel Convention and need to implement the Basel Convention as it was adopted, because in this particular case, and for those wastes that cannot be listed under OECD, the OECD decision can then no longer function as an Article 11 agreement. And so for those specific types of waste that could not be integrated, and in particular Y48 plastic waste, the OECD decision can therefore not be considered as a valid Article 11 under the Basel Convention, and this was made very clear by the text of the OECD Council decision. So what does that mean for the OECD parties, and specifically for the trade between all of the parties to the Basel Convention in the US, which is the one country that is member of the OECD, but not a party to this Basel Convention, is that trade that are listed as Y48 cannot be traded between parties and non-parties, even if they're members of the OECD of the same organization. So even for intra-OECD trade, those cannot be listed unless separate agreement is concluded that provides an equivalent level of control as that of the Basel Convention. And I think I'm going to leave it here. I think I've spoken for long enough. I'm going to give the floor now to Salome. Give her back the floor.
So now we're going to look at several of these examples of misuse of Article 11, of these agreements that were created under Article 11 to basically not implement the Basel Plastic Amendments. And the first one we're going to look at is the European Union and other EEA member states, such as Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, that failed to accept the strict definition of Y48 under the Basel Convention. using such an Article 11 agreement. And then we're going to look at the example of Canada and the US, which signed an arrangement, like a non-legally binding arrangement to allow free trade of non-hazardous waste. And under that, we can find the Y48 plastic waste. And then finally, we're going to look at Mexico, which is using the OECD Council decision, which does not regulate Y48 plastic waste, to trade with the US. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Jim.
All right. Thank you, Salome. Thank you, David. We're going to look at these three cases. And of course, this is a summary. Just give you a taste of them. In our report, we go into a great deal of depth about those situations. First one, as Salome mentioned, is an agreement actually with the EEA, which was forth by the European Union. The EEA is European Economic Area, and it includes 3 EFTA countries, not all the EFTA countries, but again, it includes Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. So within that group, they have derogated from what we consider a proper Article 11 agreement that would comply with the Basel Convention. So looking at it more closely, they've taken the definition of Y48, which is really the lion's share, the big news from COP14 when we started to regulate plastics. Y48, just to give a short paraphrase, it's the mixed and contaminated, halogenated things going to incineration, et cetera. So these are the problematic waste flows. And what they did is they said, we're not going to worry about whether the plastics are mixed anymore within the EEA, which is a really big derogation. They said, we're not going to control PVC, which is a halogenated plastic, or PFTE, which is also a halogenated plastic. And they said that all plastic waste exported to incinerators, landfills, or waste-to-energy plants will not necessarily be covered, which is part of what Y48 considers, that all the other countries of the Basel parties do have to control these things for those reasons. So not controlling these Y48 wastes is less environmentally sound than controlling them. Thus, the waste shipment regulation seeks an illegal use of Article 11 in our view. So despite these European Union and EEA countries agreeing in full to the plastic waste amendments at COP14, they came home and they said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it because why, we don't know. Europe is too good, perhaps. But it creates a double standard. It sends a very harmful message to the rest of the world that we don't really have to follow international commitments. It's a way of escaping great thing we thought we'd achieved at COP14 that everybody agreed to. So them refusing to apply the amendments in full to the waste shipment regulation is extremely problematic. Even if it were illegal, there's no good rationale for ignoring Basel in Europe. Europe, unfortunately, has a very well-documented internal plastic waste crisis going on today, which has been published about a lot, and we're going to have our speakers later from Eastern Europe describe the situation in Eastern Europe. The impacts of waste trade within the EU disproportionately impact the poor EU countries. There's definitely a situation of cost externalization within Europe. Not everyone's on the same economic playing field. And so we see waste flowing from rich to poor even within Europe. Much of this waste has been dumped and burned in farmers' fields, subject to substandard recycling. Recycling mixed polymer streams or PVC, PFTE is just as difficult in Europe as globally. Incineration and landfills are opposed by communities throughout Europe. It's not like everything is figured out and smooth. Europe is not too good for the Basel Convention. Next one I want to talk to you about is the Canadian government has done with the United States in forming an arrangement to ignore the Basel plastic amendments. So weeks before the plastic amendments came into force, Canada and the United States hastily signed an arrangement which they asserted is a valid Basel Article 11 agreement. Strange thing about it is they said it's not a legally binding accord. which really, surprised us that they would say that. An agreement is asserted with this agreement that waste management on both sides of the border is environmentally sound management. So that was the big assertion and basically the explanation of why they could allow this agreement. Thus, they would not need to apply the Basel Convention for trade between the two countries. Article 11 agreements are part of a legally binding Basel Treaty and are thus by necessity legally binding. It makes no sense to say that you're going to enter a non-legally binding Article 11 agreement. But it kind of shows you how serious they take this. They're signing an arrangement, and they're saying it's not legally binding, and they expect it to be part of a binding aspect of the Basel Convention, Article 11. Makes no sense. Asserting ESM on both sides of the Canadian-U.S. border is also making no sense and highly doubtful. In fact, in our report, we cite numerous news articles and statistics describing a very serious waste management problem with plastics on both sides of the border. Just days ago, a major plastic recycler that sources plastic waste from both sides of the border seeks to export it from the United States. In Indiana, caught fire. This plastics recycler, one of the worst industrial fires that we've ever witnessed in the United States. We've had quite a few. It made international news, certainly national news. Here it is in the New York Times. And just want to show you a quick shot.
Fire at this recycling plant in Richmond, Indiana is still burning as thousands are forced from their homes from that massive plume of black smoke. The state fire marshal believes that that black smoke is toxic and that those living within a half-mile of that plant had to be evacuated. Meanwhile, those outside that half-mile radius were told to turn off their heat or air conditioning to prevent the smoke from entering into their homes.
So meanwhile, we've also looked at some of the data, virtually available trade data, and we've learned that there's been 708 shipments of plastic waste between the time the new amendments went into force and now. These are the ones that went from Canada to countries other than the United States. Those are the ones we need to look at because they admitted they're not going to control the others, but it gives an indication of how seriously those two countries are monitoring the waste trade in plastics. So according to the Canadian government, only 76 notifications for exports, that's less than 11% of that 708, were issued. So they put out those notifications to the importing countries from Canada, and of these, only 13 of these were consented to by importing countries. It's very unlikely that only 11% of the 708 were non-hazardous plastic, B3011, because in North America, our MRFs, our materials recycling facilities, do not make clean streams of plastic. So most of the plastic waste that's going to be traded will be Y48, and yet only 11% were even looked at by the government. In fact, we have evidence that at least 31 of those 708 exports to countries other than the US were PVC waste. PVC is definitely Y48, and it has a tariff code that we can track. So we can actually see the volumes of the shipments. Y48, all 31 exports require the PIC procedure because they're not under any arrangement. These are exports to other countries besides the US, and yet only 13 export permits were given. So we know there's illegality, non-compliance going there. We didn't have a match the PVC numbers of 31 exports with only 13 permits. It gives you an idea that things are not well in control. There's not environmentally sound management happening at the US-Canadian border with plastics. It's proof of an incoherent TBM control in Canada, even for exports to non-OECD. So BAN also has evidence of 920 non-US plastic waste imports to Canada since the amendments entered into force. None of these import permits were given, and it's hard to believe none of these shipments were Y48, requiring import permits. In fact, 18 of these were PVC, so we know that things are really not being complied with at the current time. Describing the arrangements as non-legally binding, as I've mentioned, is not an option for an Article 11 agreement. Further, having no controls cannot be seen as having an equivalent level of control. When you look at what ESM this says, taking all practicable steps, don't you think it would be a practicable step to follow the obligations of the convention? That would be the first practical step you would take. So the United States Canadian arrangement is clearly an invalid use of Article 11. So looking finally at the Mexican-U.S. border, which we have a different problem, but similar Article 11 origins of problem of not doing proper Article 11 agreements. We have a situation where Mexico continues to trade in Y48 plastic with the U.S., even though the OECD said you can't use this anymore for Y48 trade. While Mexico and the U.S. had an old bilateral agreement to trade in hazardous waste called the La Paz Agreement, they do not currently have agreement in place to trade in Y48, which is not a hazardous waste. So even though that's going on, Mexico asserts that they can use the OECD Council decision, even though the OECD member states admitted that we can't use it because there was an objection by the United States. As a Basel party, then, Mexico must control the export of Y48 in accordance with Basel and cannot trade it with a non-party like the United States without a separate valid Article 11 agreement. So according to the USA EPA website, Mexico is requiring notifications from the US on a national basis. However, this is not compliant with Basel without a valid Article 11 agreement between the countries involved in the trade. You can't just do it from one side and limit the importers requiring notification. It doesn't work that way. The US lacks any authority to prosecute exporters that violate the national policy of Mexico. This creates incoherence. Imports and exports across the US-Mexican border of Y48 lack a binding PIC process and any obligation on the US to assure ESM management, facility transparency, etc. So US exporters can easily exploit the situation and seem to be doing so on a massive scale. As of December 2022, by the admission of the Mexican government, there has been no Mexican consents given to US imports. Yet the Comtrade data shows that in 2021, more than 84,000 metric tons of plastic waste moved from US to Mexico, and then the next year was more than 85,000 tons. We know that at least some of these shipments were PVC, and thus Y48, and thus PIC would be required. So that's a snapshot of Mexico, and I'm going to turn it back over to Salome, who's going to bring in of our on-the-ground speakers from that country. Thank you.
With this, Marisa Jacot will talk about the experience on the ground in Mexico, and I'll hand over to her.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and I am Marisa Jacot from Fronteras Comunes and part of the Colectiva Malditos Plásticos. And we developed, first, thank you to Basel Action Network and CIEL for inviting us to this very useful and discussion, because in Mexico, as you're going to see, we have been importing a lot of plastic waste from the United States, and this is increasing and is alarming from the communities that most of the plastic here is burning in cement kilns with a big compromise with the industry, with big industry from food and that. Okay, so let's see if, okay, plastic waste experts from Mexico has been increasing and went to up 272 between 2013 and 22. The United States, some of the findings that we have in this platform that we released last month, United States accounts for more than 90% of all the plastic waste imports to Mexico. You can see there we have 94% from a database from Mexico, and we have the 98% from a database private from data source. So we are, most of the plastic that we are imported in Mexico, it's coming from United States. So in the period that we can show that from 2015 to 2021, 623,329,308 kilograms of plastic was waste was imported from the United States to Mexico, and this represents a value from 151,866,000 $995. And this is an amount given us from the database from Mexico. And you can see that Italy, Germany, Netherlands, and China, it's only have the 3% of the rest of the total volume. So you can see the increase that we have from United States imported plastic waste. So PVC, as Jim just mentioned, is regulated, should be regulated under the Y48, and cannot be traded with a non-party, in this case from US, without a valid complaint of the Article 11 agreement. PVC is probably one of the most hazardous plastic used today, and it's you know that it's difficult to recycle. It's if you burn it, and maybe Jendrik is going to talk more about this. You have emissions from dioxin and furans, and we don't want it. And this is very, very dangerous compound and endocrine disruptor. We can see in our work that we did last month in this platform, PVC exports from United States to Mexico are increasing since the entry into force the plastic amendments, and you can check in the platform that we have all the statistics for all the entries of all type of plastics, and it should be decreased, become illegal at that time, and we are at the ending mentioning that PVC exports from US to Mexico are increasing right now. The PVC exports continue to today, and this is illegal, and this must be ended. And as I said, I just want to exemplify that PVC imports continue because the Ministry of Environment, I just want to mention one case. In 2022, give a permission only for one company to import more than 5,000 tons, which report the 70% of the PVC imports in that year. So we are still having more imports of this kind of toxic plastic and another ones. The next graphic is it's a monthly graphic that we can see all the peaks that we have in 2022, and going the base was more or less of 400,000 kilos by month, and you can see the peaks in 2002 that it's going over 1 million. The results of the imports that we have from the 1st of January 2021 to the 1st of March 2023 on PVC that must be regulated by the Y88 was for 43,115 metric tons of PVC imported from United States, as we mentioned before. And the overall recommendations that we have for the Mexican government is to seize this imports all the plastic waste that is coming to Mexico from United States, And we have enough plastic that in our country, we don't recycle it more than 20% of the waste, that the plastic waste that we have in Mexico. So we don't need to import more plastic. We don't want this plastic here. And we are demanding that these imports stop, because the recycling is also a polluting manner to handle it. We don't need it, and creates microplastic, and you use a vast of quantity of water, and also release or accumulate a lot of additives that are toxic too, and we don't need it. And also, we are demanding to the Mexican government to give us the public information, all the imports that they have been allowed. And maybe let me tell you that maybe they don't have also this information, because they are permitting that all the imports of the plastic should come to the country, and without no control. So it's very important that we start talking about this, and specific for the PVC plastic, such I said, because the toxicity that they have, and shouldn't be in the cement kilns. And and that's the last demand that we have putting here, that we don't want incineration. There's a lot of, as I mentioned in the first time at the beginning, there's a big joint ventures with the cement kilns and other companies for food and beverage, that to burn their waste, and they are calling like the new neutrality of plastics, and this is incineration. And thank you, and for this inviting us, and we are here to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marisa. We're going to let you answer questions at the end of this presentation. And with this, I'll hand over to Jindrik, who will talk about the East European situation.
Thank you, Salome, and thank you, Basel Action Network, for inviting me to this important site event. I'm Jindrik Petrlík, working with Arnica Toxics and Waste Program, where I lead also the works on dioxins and waste in general. Arnica is also a hub of International Pollutants Elimination Network for participating organizations based in Central, Eastern, and Western Europe. Let me to share with you some cases from our region. It means from mainly new or EU member states. We joined EU some 15 years ago or less, and these states faced exports of waste from former European Union states even before joining EU, but unfortunately we can see that this practice follows because these states have less control of transboundary movement of waste, and we can see that this is kind of derogation of the Basel Convention rules in Slovakia, for example, in June 2021, where mapped 5 illegal exports from Italy and Poland. Waste was dropped off at industrial and agricultural buildings, which is unfortunately quite common practice in our countries. Then also trucks coming from Slovenia, Austria, Croatia, Italy, and Hungary were seen crossing the border and dropping off waste at collective farms in small villages. Next country is Poland. When China closed its borders, the crisis with plastic waste within EU was rising. So Poland experienced coming waste from France, Germany, or UK, and unfortunately, if even Poland revoked all permits to import, the illegal trade still continued, and at the beginning of 2020, over 2,000 illegal dumps and over 100 sites set deliberately on fire, usually during weekends. And you can see at the picture that these fires definitely release huge amounts of toxic chemicals, including dioxins or PAHs and other toxic chemical emissions. Unfortunately, to set the fire at such a illegal dumps of imported waste is quite common. We experience that in Czech Republic as well, which is next country, which I would like to talk about. And unfortunately, we are in the middle of Europe, and being close to Germany and Austria, and also not very far from Italy, we experience imports of mixed household waste from these countries. There is, for example, a lot of ongoing remediations of old environmental or ecological burdens, and these are common destinations for such waste. Waste is frequently declared as plastic waste for recycling, so therefore it is sometimes hard for customs to stop such transgender movement. And when they control it, they found out that it is mixed household waste, and in fact, it's derogation of the Basel Convention rules. Next, please. Also, countries like Bulgaria or Romania are countries where the waste is illegally shipped, for example, from Italy again for recycling, but in the end it's illegally dumped in fields or burnt in old coal burning power plants, and often it is with aim to secure heating for local inhabitants. Plastic burned is unsorted mixed household waste, and coal plants are definitely not equipped for burning waste, and people in Bulgaria protest of bad air quality in the vicinity of these coal plant, power plants. Romania, in Romania, there was in April 2021 found that despite having the second lowest recycling rate in Europe, the large amounts of waste were illegally exported from the EU, mainly from Germany, Italy, UK, Belgium, and Greece. Romania is well known to being a destination for waste ending in cement kilns and burned there under not very well controlled conditions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm here for potential questions in the end. Thank you.
So thank you very much to all of our previous speakers who have highlighted some of the obvious dangers of, and some of the reason why the Basel Convention was adopted, because the way we live produces quite a number of problematic wastes, and to guarantee that they're environmentally sound and soundly managed, you need rules and need rules to protect, in particular, the most vulnerable communities and countries from dumps being waste on their territories and on their lives. So this is the very reason why the Basel Convention was adopted, in recognition that this is an issue of global concerns that present threats to human health and the environment, and that requires global rules to address them. Now, the problem with the examples that we've heard of today, again, beyond the obvious impacts on human health and the environment, is that as some countries are exploiting some, I won't even call them loopholes, but some of the weakness of the Basel Convention, and that weakness is that there is currently no institutional control by the Secretariat or by another legal body to control the validity, the legal validity of any agreement that claims to be valid under Article 11. By doing this, the countries that are developing those dubious legal agreements are leading the way, and dare I say, showing the way for other parties in other countries and other parties to the conventions to also start picking and choosing among the obligations from the global instruments and to decide which are convenient to implement and which are not convenient to implement. And over the past 2 weeks that we've been here, we've been hearing how important it is to stick to the principle and how dangerous it can be to start changing the use and practice of the rules that were established with great care. We're having this discussion in the context of the Rotterdam Convention, but also in the context of the Stockholm and Basel Convention recently. And what we're seeing here is some of the countries that sometimes pretend to be some of the leading countries in taking this question seriously, developing legal arguments that will make it possible in the future for countries to start picking and choosing. And that is the basis of the unraveling of the global rules and the global instruments that we're dealing with. There are solutions, other international instruments, not necessarily dealing with waste and toxic and hazardous waste, have been confronted to some similar issues of countries exploiting possibly weak provisions and developing some weak legal interpretation to allow going around and not meeting their obligation under the treaty. And some of those instruments have shown the way, or have shown how this can be addressed, and have adopted amendment to the very conditions to prevent this from happening. And some of this will be found in the recommendations that we have for parties to stop using those instruments that we have been talking about today, but also to prevent that from happening in the future. Jim.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, it is really kind of ironic that these three examples we're highlighting here are some of the wealthiest, most supposedly advanced countries, but they also are having horrific problems, sometimes even more than smaller countries, with managing waste. And yet these are the countries that are wanting to avoid doing what was agreed at the international level. Looking at this situation, we are extremely alarmed, and we do have some recommendations to share, and then we'll open this up to discussion. So the first recommendation is we're calling on Mexico to cease using the OECD Council decision to trade in Y48 waste because it's unusable for that purpose. They're not listed in that agreement. And we're calling on the United States to fully ratify the Basel Convention without seeking exceptions to the amendments agreed, or otherwise immediately control their plastic waste exports on a national basis. It's completely out of control on both borders of the United States. We call on Canada to withdraw and annul their arrangement with the United States. It is illegal to agree a non-binding accord to ignore Basel obligations, and consider instead amending their existing bilateral agreement with the United States to include the Annex II waste like Y48. Next recommendation is we're calling on the European Union and the EFTA countries involved in the EEA to rectify this illegal double standard for waste traded under the revised waste shipment regulation. That's what We can do some work on this. It's underway right now. It's slated for adoption perhaps later this year or early 2024. So we have an opportunity to fix that double standard right now. And other parties, as David mentioned, should consider remedies similar to those that were created at the CITES Convention to give the Secretariat the authority to evaluate and police party to non-party agreements to ensure that they are valid. There's some of the options and ideas we came up with, and perhaps you guys have some more. So I'll pass it back to Salome, and we'll get some questions and discussion going here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, we'll open it up for questions. Anyone has a question?
Or a comment.
Hi. This question is kind of technical and for David, so apologies, but since no one else was asking, I thought, why not? So I was wondering if there's any like governance on the core requirements regarding ESM, where we got that language from for all practicable steps, or if that's something to be developed further.
As far as I know, that language about practical steps has not been further elaborated on in a specific Basel decision. Jim, do you know?
Well, during the debate with the IMO Hong Kong Convention, that was where it really got interesting, where people said, okay, what is an equivalent level of control? What are we looking at? And that's where they started putting down the core elements. And some of those David mentioned. And it was certainly looked at because environmentally sound managers, that's where that language comes from, taking all practicable steps. So, of course, a lot of parties and the NGO community argue, well, the most obvious first practical step is to follow your own convention's rules. So looking at your own convention, you have a certain list of wastes, you have a prior informed consent regime, etc. That is clearly a practicable step. I don't think anybody can argue against that because all the parties agreed to it. So that's kind of the extent of the argument. Prior to that, there was more work done when some countries wanted to use Article 11 agreements to undermine the Basel Ban Amendment, so we can get out from under the Basel Ban Amendment by having bilateral agreements. At that time, the EU, people might know that Alzheimer's Ludwig Kramer from the Commission wrote a piece of legal analysis, and that's absolutely unacceptable to use Article 11 to get out from under the Ban Amendment. So this issue comes back in the convention every few years, and it's a really important one if people are actually going to look at Article 11 as a get out of the convention free card. It was never meant to be that. So we're getting concerned with these three examples from three very powerful countries. Thank you.
Any other questions or remarks?
Yeah, well, I'm from Mexico. I had experience in the issue in the Congress years ago when the discussion began with the free trade agreement. We have a proposal to ban the imports of waste from Mexico. And later it was accepted recycling. So, and since then, the acceptance of environment sound management, I think the concept itself can be vague and dispute is not, I think it's not a coincidence that has not been discussed. I am not an expert as you, Jim, as you long veteran in this matter, but since the beginning of the other conventions, because we had in a frame of synergy. And so it's clear that cement kilns incineration, it doesn't at all means an environmental science management. But apparently, so this is not touch. So this has some legitimacy for doing that. So I think we need more I think, in my opinion, I think we need a wider framework. Can be a dispute among legal points of view from your side or Mexico side, if they are violating or no the convention. So let's say they are violating. So who is abusing? I think the abuse is for those who has bigger resources, economic power, and the amount of plastic they can now export to China and go to Mexico. The same story of European Union, the biggest power who, instead of sending plastic to China, is easier and more saving costs to do it in the neighborhood. So, in my opinion, we need another more profound framework that touch the materials policy. To have I think national countries require a materials policy. So because it's clear that in this context, when we are involved in parallel with the plastic negotiation, we know and we are learned how many toxic additives has the plastic. So the plastic itself has not been considerable friendly material, or so has to redefine this. And for me, I think this need for a long-term vision for a materials policy that the state can help to move that transition. But of course, the first step probably is that those countries with more power and who produce more waste should stop sending the waste outside. For me, as a citizen, doesn't really make a difference if there is under a legal agreement with it. I don't see how this will improve if it's a legal agreement with Mexico and the United States and comply with Basel. What really will make the difference in terms of changing the legitimacy of these dirty technologies? It's a question that I don't get it. The final demands recommendations that Marisa Yacot and the collective of the plastic said, well, we don't want more plastic from overseas because we have enough plastic. And that's true. We have enough presence of incineration and cement kilns. We have enough lobby of developing agencies and promoting incineration. So we need a change, and the Mexico government also needs to enforce the discussion, open the discussion more openly with the Mexican community to discuss this state materials policy, to discuss more to reinforce the sovereignty or the core government to protect more the human health and environment, as the government of Mexico is doing in other areas where we are more involved in terms of defending the native maize against the GMO, fighting glyphosate. There has been a lot of problems with the United States. So the kind of reinforce our sovereignty to protect human health and environment, and taking a step back in terms of choosing the technology that should be promoted, and making incentives for the best technology, and have a difficult but critical relation with the United States. So I think we can do it. But in terms of this specific issue, so in your experience, so what will be this new legal agreement between USA and Mexico, if they want to comply, in the scenario they accept, they say, okay, we are not doing the right thing, we are in the hypothetical scenario that the United States agree to have an agreement with Mexico, and will be the same with Canada, but I don't believe that will happen, but let's think this happen. They can do a legal agreement. So what kind of new ingredients will incorporate this agreement that can improve the conditions of trade at that? Will that change the role of cement kilns or others? So let's clarify this. So so the people who are watching this, especially from Mexico and Latin America, can understand the relevance of the matter. Sorry for taking so long.
No, it's okay. Thanks for your question. I think you need to turn off your microphone. Thanks for your question. And first of all, I think it's important to recognize that, as you highlighted and as you mentioned, the issue with plastic waste is not just a waste issue. And it cannot be dealt uniquely by restricting the transboundary movement of waste. The reason why we're seeing all of those transboundary movement of plastic waste, legal and illegal, because we're producing too much of it and we don't know what to do with it. And this is the reason why, in parallel to implementing some stricter rules about the transboundary movement of plastic waste under the Basel Convention, as you highlighted, we're also negotiating currently different instruments that is trying to address the plastic crisis overall and to deal with the plastic crisis in a broader approach. So I think it's important to recognize that even if the Article 11 agreements, or even if the Basel Convention was fully implemented between the countries that we know today, I don't believe that this would be a silver bullet and that we suddenly would not have an issue with how we're dealing with the waste. There's additional work that is currently being done within the Basel Convention about the technical guidelines. How should plastic waste be addressed and how should it be dealt with in an environmentally sound manner? Now, that doesn't mean that complying with the Basel Convention as it is designed would have no effects and would have no impact. The first thing that it would do is that it would address the transparency issue, because all of these waste, all of those shipments of waste would have to be documented. There would be a paper trace about it, and it would allow citizens on both sides of the border to know and to have access to the data and to understand what is the problem that we're trying to deal with. And it's often a very important first step to design a good solution, to know what is the problem that you're trying to deal with, and it avoids the possibility of denial about we're not having a problem and we're actually capable of dealing with those issues. So that's a first valuable aspect of complying with the convention as it is designed. The other is that it would force the importing governments to reconcile the fact that they're importing materials and to identify where is this material going, for what kind of treatment, and to do what, and to then take an informed decision about whether it should be imported and what should be done with it. Again, this is an area where the transparency would be extremely important because it allows citizens that are impacted by those decisions to also weigh in, and that is, the basis of our imperfect democracies that we currently live in. So that is some of the aspects that change with this situation. Empower the government to act and to refuse some of those, and would provide a much needed transparency about all those shipments and transboundary movement that will then further empower citizens and governments to deal with the situation.
Yeah, that's one right there, is that Basel is not going to solve all the problems. It's going to give you the framework. It's going to give you the transparency, the right to refusal. It's going to require environmentally sound management, so local groups can say, hey, this isn't environmentally sound management, look at this dump out in the back here. So it gives you the hook to start questioning and looking more upstream, which is where the answers will lie. Right now we have this huge debate in this meeting about what is ESN for plastic recycling. And for the first time that I've ever seen, a class that's being aggressively pushed, a class of management, aggressively pushed by the fossil fuel industry, which is chemical recycling, is receiving a rejection by the parties here. So they're asking themselves, is this ESN? We're not just going to accept things because someone says it is. So you'll have the right to do that, and you'll have the right to refuse with the tools that the Basel Convention supplies. But yeah, it's not the total answer by any means. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
I would give two observations. Since European Union was addressed, first of all, cases of illegal shipments within the Union, I fully agree these were illegal shipments, but they are illegal under the shipment regulation. This is not related to the entry EU 3011 because all these wastes are not covered by this entry. So they are illegal because there had to be a notification. And the only way to combat that is more controls at the border, more controls within the country, and tracking illegal shipments. The other observation I would like to make is that Jim also referred to the European Union as a country. We are in a different situation than other countries because we are sovereign countries, but we are also in a very close union and an ever closer union. So it is not really totally fair to blame us for having our own rules when we handle together.
Thank you very much. Those are very good points, both of them. One thing to mention is I don't think anybody is, or at least this is not what we're trying to say or argue against, the possibility for European countries or the European Union as a regional union to adopt its own rules. But I think it is very important that it does so in a way that complies with the international obligation that it has subject itself to. Again, because if it doesn't, it creates and opens the door for any other countries to start adopting similar kinds of legal reasoning to decide, well, in that particular case, the European Union may have a case to do things differently. Then it has to do this in a way that is legally valid according to its international obligations and to justify this in a way that is legally valid. Otherwise, I'm sure other countries or other regions in the world would find also arguments that they could use to say, well, we need special rules. Well, we are in a different situation. But the very reason why the Basel Convention was adopted and was ratified by such a large number of countries was the recognition that we need rules that applies to everyone, because this is a problem that no countries can solve on its own, or that no countries can decide to set its own rule because it's an issue of global concern. Other than that, I think the points that you've made are absolutely valid. Thanks.
So yeah, I misspoke when I meant to say that some of the most powerful entities out there in the geopolitics, but the point I was trying to make is that what the EU is doing, sure, nobody likes illegal traffic, but they're making much more of the traffic which would be legal. And there's nothing in the Basel Convention that says that the parties or member states of the European Union don't have to follow the sovereignty and the rules of the Basel Convention. They are parties, and so is the Political Integration Organization of the Commission. They all have to follow it. Nothing's in there that says the Political Integration Organization can just be treated as one country. So they all have obligations, and when Europe, like anywhere else on the world right now, you've got serious problems with management, transboundary movement going awry, illegal traffic. It isn't a time to say we're better than the rest of the world, therefore we don't have to follow the same rules. So that I don't think you're arguing that, but that's what's happened here.
We had a question this side of the room. Yes, please.
Thank you. I would like to ask you about the Middle East, especially the Arab countries. Have you witnessed any illegal transboundary among them? And if you have any data about this, can we share it with us? Thank you.
I don't have any that comes to mind. We're keeping an eye on the whole world. If you go to our website, we have a special area called the Plastic Waste Transparency Project, and we do publish data. So far as the Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries, I'm not seeing them pop up with numbers, but we do keep an eye on it. And if you write me a note, I can do special searches on some of the databases that we subscribe to and see if I can give you some data. So get back in touch. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you for a very interesting and excellent side event. My name is Bashkut Tunjak. I had a somewhat related question, and that was around a more specific country, which is Turkey, which is where my family comes from. So Turkey's in a unique situation in that it's an OECD member, and I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but I was just wondering how all of this relates to the situation of a country like Turkey, where they are an OECD member, and whether the OECD may be doing something to address the situation where some members of the OECD may have more or less capacities internally than others. Thank you.
Yes, it's well recognized that Turkey and to some extent Mexico and some other new members to the OECD create kind of an anomaly in the OECD, non-OECD dynamic. And I think the news stories tell it all. I mean, Turkey is getting, we knew they were getting old ships for recycling. All those old shipyards, shipbreaking yards are environmentally sound by any means. They've been hammered with electronic waste, plastic waste. The area of Adani in Turkey is getting hammered with massive amounts of shipments of plastic waste. The government there is not doing a good job of controlling it. Like many parts of the world, they are kind of at a crossroads of really getting hit from all sides. And they are OECD, and to the credit of the European Union's Commission, when they created their recast of the waste shipment regulations first draft, they recognized that we can't just have a blind eye that anything OECD is okay, that they started putting in language to really check and have actual monitoring by the Commission and independent bodies to see if facilities, even in OECD countries, are ESM. So there's some new language which we really support. It doesn't just say, okay, it's OECD, it's fine. It's just as bad as saying, okay, it's EU, it's fine. This will find the path of least economic resistance. It will exploit people if we don't pay attention. And that's what the Basel Convention is here to do.
Thanks. That is a very good point, very important to raise. As to your specific question about is the OECD doing something specific to support this, I think it would be useful to have a representative of the OECD to respond to that question. But one thing that we could say is that it is not designed to make distinction between different levels of membership within the OECD, and so all members are considered. And this is part of the issue that has been raised by a number of countries, and that is being recognized, in fact, by the European Commission. And that was part of the key negotiations and discussions around how and whether to integrate the provisions of the Basel Plastic Amendment into the OECD decisions. And so that was part of the discussion. As far as I know, it would be useful to direct this question to the OECD. There is no specific capacity building or specific funding mechanism to support specific OECD countries. These programs usually happen prior to joining, to becoming an OECD member, because once you become a member, members are considered equally by the institution.
Any other questions? Any other comments or questions? Okay. Thank you very much for coming to our side event, and we wish you a nice evening.
Thanks, everybody, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A nice evening and good night.
Thank you.